All freshmen at the Jesuit high school that I attended in Denver were required to take a class titled simply Freshman Theology. But it might have been more properly titled Introduction to the Pentateuch. That's one of the names given for the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. In Jewish tradition, these are called Torah, or the books of the law. And while Leviticus is chock full of all the kinds of commands that we think of when we use the word law, it also contains the Torah. It also contains the family stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the liberation narrative of Moses leading the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. These too are considered part of the law. As high school freshmen, these stories were our first introduction to thinking critically as well as faithfully when it came to biblical texts. And when we got to the end of the book of Genesis, instead of having us read the saga of Joseph and his brothers, Father Bershek took us into the chapel, gave us lyric sheets, and played the soundtrack of Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. That's how I first learned this story. And I've been in 2 productions of that show since, so I could pretty much sing the whole thing for you right now. Don't worry, I won't do it. I'm trying to save my voice. It's a fun show that does a decent enough job of relating the events of the Joseph story, but beneath the fun of a country western ode to fallen Joseph, or a pharaoh reminiscent of Elvis, or a calypso number in defense of Benjamin, underneath all of that is a much more complicated family drama that begins long before Joseph and his brothers are even born. You see, their father Jacob was something of a troublemaker. After taking his brother's birthright and tricking their father into giving him his dying blessing, Jacob has to run for his life. And he ends up at the home and with the family of a man named Laban, who has 2 daughters. Jacob works for 7 years for the chance to marry the younger of the 2, Rebekah, that he is madly in love with. But when he goes into the wedding tent, the trickster gets tricked and ends up married to the older sister, Leah, instead. The younger daughter cannot be married before the older one, he's told. So then he works another 7 years because he really wants to marry Rebekah. And eventually Jacob will settle down with 2 more wives, return home and father 12 sons who will become the 12 tribes of Israel. But it should be clear, of the 4 wives, Rebekah is the clear favorite, which means that the sons that he has with her, Joseph and Benjamin, are also the favorites. You could say that that's where the trouble began, but as you can see, as is the case with most family dramas, it starts at least a generation or 2 before then. Joseph is not the oldest, but he is the favorite. In fact, he's the child of Jacob's old age, one of the younger ones. But it's clear that he's the favorite because Jacob goes to considerable effort and expense to have a fancy ornamental robe crafted for his favorite son. And you don't have to be an expert in family systems to know how that's going to play with all the rest of the brothers. And if the robe isn't bad enough, Joseph starts having dreams that he shares with his family. One about 11 sheaves bowing down to him, and one about the sun and the moon and the stars, 11 stars, all bowing down to him. These are not subtle dreams. And if they didn't hate him before the dreams, they sure as heck despised him after them. Well, one day, when they have him alone in the fields, they make a plan to kill him. Only one of the brothers tries to pull him back and temper them and suggest that instead of killing him, they rough him up instead. So they tear off his fancy robe, they throw him in a pit, and no sooner do they do that than a caravan comes along, and they get the bright idea to sell their brother into slavery to the caravan and be done with the whole thing. So the caravan carries Joseph off to Egypt, and the brothers take that precious coat and they tear it to pieces, dip it in goat's blood, and then come back to their father Jacob with this sad sob story about, isn't it awful how Joseph was attacked by wild animals and killed. R.I.P. Meanwhile, Joseph is in captivity at Egypt. He gets sold to the house of a royal officer named Potiphar, and because God is with Joseph, Potiphar's household thrives. In fact, Joseph has so much riz, as the kids like to say, that he catches the eye of Potiphar's wife. And when he turns down her advances, she accuses him of trying to assault her, and Potiphar has him thrown into prison. And yet, even in prison, God is with him. He's put in charge of all the other prisoners. He begins interpreting their dreams. And so when Pharaoh starts to have bad dreams, his cupbearer says, hey, I remember this guy that I met in prison. You should talk to him. And so Joseph meets with the Pharaoh, tells him that these dreams that he's having about fat cows and skinny cows, fat grain and skinny grain, are all a forecast for Egypt. 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh is so impressed by this amazingly wise person in front of him that he puts Joseph in charge of the whole plan to save Egypt by storing up the surplus in the years of plenty to ride out the famine. There is no one in Egypt at this point other than the Pharaoh himself who is greater than Joseph. So great is his power. And when the famine hits, Egypt is well stocked. But the famine isn't just in Egypt. It reaches all the way to the land of Canaan, where Jacob and Joseph's brothers still live and are starving. Word reaches them of the plenty in Egypt, and so they set out to buy grain. When they arrive in Egypt, Joseph recognizes them immediately. But they don't recognize him. How could they? They remember a skinny kid they sold to the Ishmaelites, not some high-ranking Egyptian official. They don't know him, but he knows them. Now, this is all a very long way of getting to where our reading is this morning, and I would love to tell you that that's where we pick up, but no. Joseph does not get to forgiveness right away. He doesn't immediately take pity on this family that sold him into slavery. He's ready for a little payback. So when we hear this story against the backdrop of Jesus telling us to love and forgive our enemies, we might think, oh, look at Joseph, look at how he forgave his brothers. But this is what you need to know. Before that happens, he accuses them of being spies, throws them into prison, sells them the grain, and tells them if they want any more, then when they come back, they better bring all of their brothers, including the youngest, Benjamin. Well, Jacob doesn't want Benjamin go. Joseph's already dead. Benjamin's his other favorite. But they come back with Benjamin. And does Joseph forgive them then? No. He has a silver cup planted in Benjamin's sack, and then accuses him of stealing it and threatens to kill him. All of which is to say, it isn't quite as simple as Joseph forgives his brothers. When he says, do not be angry or distressed with yourselves, because God sent me before you to preserve life. Quite frankly, I would be angry and distressed with Joseph still for all these shenanigans. Families and generational trauma are rarely cut and dry. As people of faith, I think we miss that point sometimes. Every person that God chooses is flawed in one way or another, which is to say every person that God chooses is just as human as we are. The point of these stories is not to say to us, be more like Jacob. I don't think so. Be more like Joseph. Be more like Moses. More like Joshua or David. No. The great comfort of the law of God is the way it holds up the mirror and shows us that the people that God works through to bring about God's purposes, to feed the hungry and preserve life, are every bit as messed up as we are. When people talk about biblical family values, what they should be talking about is how, while families can be a blessing, they can also be rife with jealousy, violence, and heartbreak. But that doesn't mean that God can't still be at work through them. The Bible doesn't allow us to pretend that family is all that it's cracked up to be. Whether that's our family of origins, the families we create for ourselves, or the families that we find in church communities like this one. Yes, Joseph's dreams are realized in this moment. But those dreams were also the source of all the hard feelings that set the whole thing in motion to start with. The vision that will sustain us in the darkness may also be the one that breaks things apart before bringing them back together. It's rarely neat and tidy. It's as messy and as fraught with pain as crucifixion and resurrection. When darkness would derail us and throw us into despair, it is the light that shines in the darkness that sustains and provides for us. Provides for our physical needs, to be sure, but provides also the means and the circumstances by which forgiveness can take place in the end. Knitting our fractured lives and our fractured families back together. Hallelujah. Amen. Would you stand as together we say what we believe, using the words of affirmation printed in your worship